Shabbat Shalom. Good morning and welcome to another little Torah discussion. This week we are in the portion Vayishlach, which is Genesis 32:4 through 36:43. And if you remember last week, the way we ended the portion, Jacob was leaving his mother's brother Laban with his two wives and all of his children and all the flocks and the wealth that he had gained. And so this Torah portion opens and he's on the precipice of coming back into his father's land. And of course, the reason he left in the first place is because he feared for his life. After deceiving Esau, Esau wanted to kill him. And so even after all these years, Jacob is a little bit worried about what's going to happen when his brother sees him again. And so in Genesis 32, I'm going to start at verse 11. And this is Jacob praying to Yahweh. What he says is, I am unworthy of all the kindness that you have so steadfastly shown your servant. With my staff alone I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, else I fear he may come and strike me down, mothers and children alike. Yet you have said, I will deal bountifully with you, and make your offspring as the sands of the sea, which are too numerous to count. And so he fears for his life, and he's calling out to Yahweh, and he's reminding Yahweh of his promise, which he gave him when he left the land. This is when Jacob had the dream. He anointed the rock that was at his head afterwards and named the place Bethel. This is essentially the prophecy that Yahweh had given him. And so he's calling on that. He's calling on his promise. Reminding Yahweh of his promise, just, I guess, desperate not to die. And so what happens shortly after this, in chapter 33, we're still in chapter 32. I wrote 33, but it's 32. A little bit later in this verse, this is when he has the dream, and he's wrestling with the angel. And he's essentially asking for the name, and he gets renamed by the angel. It's a very strange passage. I've always had a little bit of trouble understanding it, what it's all about. But something stuck out to me this time. And this is when the angel or the being asks Jacob his name, which of course he already knows. So this is chapter 32, verse 28. Said the other, or the angel, what is your name? He replied, Jacob. Said he, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with beings divine and human and have prevailed. And so I want to focus on the striven with human beings part. It's true that he just got done striving with Laban for years and years and years, undergoing the deception, getting the wrong wife the first time, the flocks, and all of the stuff that he had to deal with Laban. But I also think that this may be a little bit of a prophecy, because Jacob just got done praying to Yahweh. He's fearing for his life. He doesn't want Esau to kill him. He's reminding Yahweh what he said about his offspring. He doesn't want Esau to kill his offspring either. I think it's probably a dual fear. He doesn't want to die, but he also doesn't want Esau to kill his children, because then the promise really can't be fulfilled. If he alone died, the promise could still be fulfilled, because he at this point had all of his children. And so I see this a little bit, this statement from the divine being, as a prophecy that Esau will not prevail, because not only have you striven already against Laban and prevailed, you will strive against Esau and prevailed. And I find it interesting that this is the point where he gets a new name. It's like symbolic of a new birth, or he's coming into the land again, the land that he had left, with all of his children. And to me, it just means that Yahweh is telling him, I do still have plans for your life. It's not just your children that are going to carry on this prophecy, but you're going to be in this land. I told you I would bring you back. If you remember last week in the portion, Yahweh promised, I will bring you back to this place. And so I think this second dream at this site with this prophecy is just an answer to all of that. It's precipitated by the prayer of Jacob, but I think it's much deeper than that. And so my guess is that after this dream, now Jacob really didn't fear Esau as much. Um, but I'm not so sure about that, because if you read, when they come, he sends them in droves. He separates the children and their mothers into different droves, and then he puts Rachel last, because he loves her the most and those children the most. So I'm not really sure, but that's kind of how I get it. And so then when he finally does see Esau, there's some interesting verbiage here, and I think it's just another way to appease him, but I find it ironic. And so what he's saying is he's calling Esau my lord, and he's referring to himself as your servant, or Esau's servant. And this I find ironic, because it's the exact opposite of Isaac's blessing, the blessing that he stole, which is that the oldest would serve the youngest. And in this case, Jacob is kind of flip-flopping the roles, so I don't know if he's doing that as a way to appease Esau, to again just try to get him not to kill him or not to kill his family. But I find it interesting. The other interesting part about this verse is Esau wants to travel together, and Jacob says, no, the kids are tired, the flocks, if we drive them too hard, they'll die. You go on ahead and I'll follow. And there's a little bit of resistance on the part of Esau, and finally he agrees and he goes on. And Jacob goes on, and he never makes it to where Esau goes. He travels on to Sukkoth and settles there. And I was wondering, is this just another example of Jacob's deception of Esau? That fits with kind of what he did with stealing the blessing. Later, though, something very curious in chapter 36, verse 7, it actually says that they separated because the land didn't have enough space for all of them. And so I don't know if there's some context missing here. It's probably a little bit of both. But one thing that does happen is that Isaac does die in this portion, and he's buried by both of his sons. The scripture records that both Jacob and Esau buried him. So clearly they are at least in the same room together. And there doesn't seem to be any type of animosity because of this split, which could be seen as deceptive because Jacob didn't follow. Now, but then we have the interesting bit where Dinah essentially gets raped by a man of the land that they're traveling through, and her brothers Levi and Simeon deceive. So you have that theme of deception again. They deceive the inhabitants of that land by convincing the males to be circumcised, promising their sister can marry this young man who loves her, or claims he loves her. If he gets circumcised and all the males in the town get circumcised, then they agree to intermingle and intermarry more widely. And so when they've done this and they're in pain from the procedure, then Levi and Simeon go and slay all the males. And when Jacob finds out, he's pretty upset. And so in chapter 34, verse 7, I just had to make sure. I've been writing down the wrong chapters here in my notes. So in chapter 34, verse 7, I find it interesting. It says this: Meanwhile, Jacob's sons, having heard the news, came in from the field. The men were distressed and very angry because he had committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing not to be done. And that struck me. I was like, oh, an outrage in Israel. I think this is actually the first time that Israel as a concept, as a land, as a people, is referred to in Scripture. And I could be wrong, but I think this is the first time. And the first time we see Israel mentioned is just a few verses before, when he changes Jacob's name to Israel. And so I would be really curious to know if Israel is referred to before this point. But as far as I know, and as far as I can remember, I think this is the first point, and I find it very interesting. And the other interesting thing is that Jacob is referred to as Jacob, but Israel then comes next. So it's not saying that they committed an outrage in Israel by laying with Israel's daughters. It says they committed an outrage in Israel by laying with Jacob's daughters. So that's, again, very, very interesting. So the next thing I find interesting is that now the whole thing with Dinah happened. They're on the precipice now of coming back into the land that Jacob had left. The round trip is almost complete, and this was the prophecy. When Jacob was on the way out, he said, "I will not, leave you until I bring you back here." So he said he was going to bring Jacob back, and here he is about to come back. And in chapter 35, verse 1, there's some interesting imagery here. So it says, Elohim said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and remain there." And in verse 2, well, let's read the whole thing. I think it's important. It says, "Arise, go up to Bethel and remain there. Build an altar there to the Elohim who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and all who are with him, "Rid yourselves of the alien gods in your midst. Purify yourselves. Change your clothes. Come, let us go up to Bethel. And I will build an altar there to the Elohim who answered me when I was in distress and who has been with me wherever I have gone." This imagery, when I first read it, reminded me a little bit of when the children of Israel were preparing to accept Torah at the foot of the mountain. And so just going to go there really quick. This is in Exodus chapter 19, and we will start in verse 10. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes, let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day Yahweh will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai." So it's interesting. The people are purified, preparing for this situation in both cases. In Genesis, Jacob says the people are going to go up. In Exodus, it says Yahweh is going to come down. So I find that very interesting kind of parallel imagery that it just reminded me of what was going on. And then just a little bit later, after he's telling the people to purify themselves, we get Yahweh speaking to Jacob. And it's essentially a blessing. So I'm going to read it. This is chapter 35, verse 9. It says, "God appeared again to Jacob on his arrival from Padan Aram, and he blessed him. Elohim said to him, 'You whose name is Jacob, you shall be called Jacob no more, but Israel shall be your name.' Thus he named him Israel. And Elohim said to him, 'I am El Shaddai. Be fertile and increase. A nation, yea, an assembly of nations, shall descend from you. Kings shall issue from your loins. The land that I assigned to Abraham and Isaac, I assign to you, and to your offspring to come will I assign the land.'" And so this blessing is very reminiscent of the prophecy that was given in this exact same spot. The prophecy was given when Jacob was on his way out, and now that Yahweh has completed his promise of bringing him back, he gives a blessing in the exact same spot. And so let's just go back really quick to the blessing, which was chapter 28, verse 13. It says, "And Yahweh was standing behind him, and he said, 'I am Yahweh, the Elohim of your father Abraham, and the Elohim of Isaac. The ground on which you are lying I will assign to you and to your offspring. Your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and your descendants. Remember, I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you.'" And so you see this duality, this parallel between the nations of the earth, the offspring being fertile and increasing, them getting the land, and this hearkening back to Abraham and Isaac in the original promise that Yahweh made to them. And so you see that in the prophecy, and you see that in the blessing from Yahweh. And now what's interesting here is, just as before, Jacob's setting up a pillar. Before, he set it up and anointed it, and we discussed that being unique and interesting compared to past instances where people have set up altars. But here, another interesting and first thing happens, which is where he also makes an offering on it. And so everything is complete. The first time it was like he was setting up and preparing the altar, and then once the prophecy is complete and he's brought back to the land, now he has wives and children and riches and wealth. He's making the offering. And then after that, what happens is Rachel dies, and you get a bit of the lineage of Esau. And that's the end of this portion. And so one last thing that actually struck out to me with this portion, up to this last point we discussed, is renaming happens twice. So Jacob is renamed to Israel when he strives with the divine being, but here in this blessing from Yahweh, Yahweh renames him Israel. We also see that Jacob, if we read verse 15, it says he gave the site where Elohim has spoken to him the name of Bethel. And this is not a new naming. He named it that before. He named it that Bethel the last time when he was on the way out. He had the dream, received the prophecy blessing, and was on the way out. And so these namings, I'm just wondering if them happening twice is like the concept of the two witnesses that we see. It's said twice and the thing is done. And so that was my thought on that. I just found it interesting that the name change is repeated. In both cases, is actually a name change, naming of a place and the naming of a person. So that's all I have for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, please leave any comments, share your insights with me that you've had, text to me, hold me accountable. I definitely don't think I have the authority on the truth. I just want to share my thoughts and midrash with people. And so I welcome any and all comments. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.